Hi, I'm Chris the Counsellor, and I just wanted to make a little introduction to this video and give you a few updates on where things are up to. Some of you may have already seen this conversation over on the Path to Practice YouTube channel. I'll put a link in the description below. But Harry has very kindly let me post some of the video on my channel just for you as subscribers in case you hadn't seen it. This is the first time that I have been interviewed and was able to just explore some of these topics in depth. I think there's some really interesting areas that we look at, including authenticity, incongruence, some tips for training to be a counsellor, and also lots more. So I'll put all the timestamps in the description below so you can skip to the bits that you want to watch. And if you want to watch the full video, you can head over to Harry's channel. And again, I'll put a link in the description below. So if there are any updates from me, I tend to post those on Instagram. If I can't post a video about it, or if it's just some information that I'm sharing, then that's most likely to be on Instagram. So you can follow that from the description for any other updates that are coming up. I've got some podcasts that are coming out shortly with other people. I'm lining up some conversations with some person-centered therapists, which I'm very excited about. And also, if there's any videos you haven't seen on the channel that you would like to, then please leave a comment below on this video as well. Okay, without much further ado, I will share this video. I'll be really interested to hear what you think about it, if there's any questions that come off the back of it, or anything that you're left with after watching it. And I really hope that you enjoy it.
We live a large part in an incongruent world where incongruence is kind of promoted a lot. Is you get on, you do your work, you don't moan about it, you kind of stiff up a lip, you get on, that type of thing. As people learn about counselling and themselves, they start to see the value in being more congruent and see that actually it is okay and I do have a right to feel these things. And so what happens with that pendulum swing is often it goes right over the other way. And, you know, I've heard lots of things with students, and again, my own experience, where it's like you almost become uber external congruence. Is almost like, well, I'm just telling you how I feel. Well, I feel like this and I have a right to feel it. And you kind of just expressing stuff all the time in the name of congruence. And then I think it might come back to a bit more of a middle ground where it's like, okay, a balance between those. What's appropriate? How do I communicate this? A lot of my kind of childhood and teenage years and things have been like a people pleaser and, you know, trying to kind of be good and nice and respected and all of those things. And I guess through counseling training, that kind of loosened quite a lot. And I was glad of it. But as I said, I kind of would go the other way then. And I'd be like, well, I don't have to do this anymore. And I don't have to do that anymore. And would really kind of lean in to letting go of some of that conditionality. And so what I'm actually doing at the moment is really trying to make space where I don't get pulled into that feeling of being responsible or that feeling of having to meet another person's needs or be a certain way. And because that's quite kind of fragile in me and quite in young stages in a way, you know, it's like I have to take it tentatively one step at a time, and I have to try and create as many spaces as I can where it's like I can just really tune into my own needs at times and be able to say, okay, what do I need and how do I kind of stay true to myself and honor myself and respect myself? And then again, you know, the swing the other way is almost like once I've had that, I think that really protected time, that will then allow me to come back out to then have a balance of like, yeah, sometimes I want to see to other people's needs and I want to be helpful. And other times I really need to kind of honor myself and my own needs, and protect that as well, even when it's difficult.
Just thinking about it from the client's perspective, I mean, I'm sure people can understand how, as a therapist, we can cultivate those qualities and embody them in session. But how does that bring about change for a client?
It's about the space we create for the client to use as they need. Often therapy is related to and seen through a lens of I do these things to create this outcome, or this is progressive, or this will help the client, for example. It might be a little bit more technique based or a bit more tool based or something like that. The difference when we look at person-centered therapy is it's just about the space we create, and that the end point is not known because it is so unique and individual to that person. So the best that I can do is really offer those conditions, create that space for a person to use that as they need. And the outcomes of that will be so varied and so individual. It maybe stands apart a little bit from other therapies in that way. If I think about something like anxiety, for example, a lot of other therapies might have like techniques to deal with anxiety. But I know for myself, at least in my own experience of client work, anxiety is a very kind of generalized term for a very individual experience. So I guess, as Roger said, when he talked about psychological tension, this idea of anxiety comes from incongruence, from not being authentic. And so therefore, rather than the fix to anxiety being tools or techniques, it's maybe more about what is that incongruence? What is that psychological tension about in the person? And I think that's how change happens. I think ultimately it's a process of the client becoming more authentic, and becoming more themselves and kind of taking off some of those shackles we've talked about in terms of like conditionality or shoulds or ought tos or anything like that, really. Yeah.
I can definitely think back to times when me solving my own problem came down to me telling someone something that I really believed that I wasn't telling them. And that was the dissonance in me that was putting me into a very challenged place. And it all came down to telling someone something that I wanted them to know, but I felt like I couldn't.
Yeah, and we might not even know that's what it is. I don't know if that was your experience, but we might actually have the discomfort and we don't know why.
That's exactly right, yeah. It took me a long time to work out what it was and then to find the courage to say that thing. It's maybe an example of the change that giving someone the space they need to go to the place they need to go can offer.
Maybe that would make that feel more possible, or maybe you'll come to realize those things if you're given that space. If you can be more authentic, maybe there's an ease that might come with that eventually, or it's like we don't have to hold those things. Because when I think about like shoulds and oughts, it's like I think of tension, and the more we can be authentic, I think of a kind of releasing and a kind of like, okay, I can find my flow in the world. And I'm not saying it's always easy, but maybe it comes with less tension ultimately.
What are some ideas that might be really interesting for people like me who are training, who understand those three, as a follow-on to those from a theoretical point of view in the person-centered approach?
Something like the 19 propositions, like I really love that theory. That goes through about kind of human development. So how we become the way we are, that we are basically kind of the center of our own universe. That's all our experience. And that's what reality is for, is our experience as the center of the world. And then it kind of talks about how we behave and respond to different things as well. So it brings out these things like conditions of worth and introjections. It looks at how we defend our views, especially if we're challenged or pushed against, that actually will probably kind of dig our heels in even deeper. And then for me, it goes into why we work the way that we do as therapists, because it starts to talk about the best way to understand another person is through their point of view. And therefore, the more we can offer that and the more we accept them, the more that they will allow us in, the more that they relax and they might share more of themselves and feel understood in that. And that brings us to a more authentic way. The problem with them is they're written in a really uninviting way. They were written at a time where Rogers had to be really scientific and trying to prove the approach. And I think that puts a lot of people off, as well as it being quite lengthy. But I think once it's simplified, they're much more relatable. And I think people have that same experience of saying, wow, okay, yeah, that does make sense. I can see that happening in myself all around me. And for me, it's like a catch-all of human development and behavior,
Person-centered therapy is very much about cultivating the relationship and the conditions for people to explore. It opens the door to these kind of deep moments of insight and transcendence. What have you found to be the place for those in the work that you do?
It makes me think of two things in relation to that. One is this idea of kind of relational depth, which kind of maybe touches on some of what you're talking about there, and is often described as this kind of transcendent thing where it's almost like you're in a bit of a different space relationally and individually in some way. People describe that as when the therapy might go to a different level, in a sense, is that you're relating at depth, you're meeting at depth, there's a knowing between you, there's a real synchronicity and flow between you as well. And so for the way I think about it is like it moves a lot from the head and it just becomes a kind of flow state almost relationally. There are criticisms of that for sure, that some people will say that there's a risk with theories like relational depth because it could potentially become an agenda, or it might become a hierarchical thing where people are saying, I want to achieve relational depth, or it's a way that we judge our therapy rather than it just being a kind of natural outcome. The other thing I think about those, it almost sounds like those kind of light bulb moments at times where we realize things for ourselves, and I guess in a person-centered viewpoint that can really come out of relationship, to really be accepted and understood, maybe allows us to go to places that we haven't done before, or allows us to realize things that we haven't done before. I know for myself and in clients, there can be this desire to maybe get to a certain place, but not like wondering, how do I get there, or how do I change? And actually it can just be a little change in perspective or a realization of one thing. And it's almost like it happens automatically. Like we're trying to force change, but actually something might just look a bit different, or we understand it quite differently. And that is the change, and we can't go back almost, So for me, it's those profound moments that might be like, oh yeah, okay, that is the truth. That is how I see it. And now I'll see everything different as a result of that.
Person-centered therapy is often described as non-directive. So how do you balance giving the client autonomy with also being a guiding force in the session?
My focus is on trying to get a sense of them as best I can, to understand what it's like to be them in the world and hear that as best as possible. One of the stereotypes of person-centered is that it can be really passive. And I personally don't agree with that so much. I think it can be practiced that way. But for me, there's no link between being person-centered and being passive. Because if I'm really in relationship, if I'm really listening deeply, then that feels a very active thing. That feels very alive and very, active is maybe the best word. I think the passive thing comes when people maybe just, people say like they'll just nod along and kind of, repeat the last thing you've said. And for me, that isn't person-centered. That isn't a desire to understand. That isn't a desire to communicate acceptance. That is just listening, just listening skills. And for me, that is very, very different to deeply understanding and hearing someone and accompanying them on that journey and exploration as well. That feels a very different thing.
So when you're involved in the conversation, the intention is to really try to understand and make sure that you are with them and ask questions that clarify, communicate your empathic understanding, all those sorts of things.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And the questions is an interesting one as well, because that can be another stereotype around, people are often told you can't ask questions in person-centered counseling. But, I think if the desire is to understand and I need to ask a question to understand deeper, then, I think there's a place for them. But again, it's not often, a lot of the time questions can be kind of, agendered but disguised agenda. So people would, ask something like, "Oh, do you think da 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 da?" Or they're trying to put in their input disguised in a question. So for me, if I'm asking a question, it's because I'm not quite following, or I do want to understand at a deeper level, rather than that I'm trying to do something or that I'm up to something, you know.
How do you handle it when clients ask for your advice?
Yeah, that can be a tricky one. I think, like, if it's simple, like if I have something, then I will give it. But I think I really do believe that often I don't know what is best for them, because they are a different person. They've had a totally different life. But I think it is important to meet those things with respect. So it's like, it wouldn't just be like, oh, I don't know, or I'd try and avoid the question discreetly. It's like, I really want to meet them in that request, you know. So it might be something like, I know you really want me to give you an idea of what you should do here. And I might say something about what they've told me about the situation up to this point to kind of represent it. But a lot of the time, I don't know what is best for people. And so, yeah, that can be a tricky thing, because I think people can come in, especially to therapy, expecting that. And I think they're used to that in the world as well. And that can be a bit of a period of kind of, I guess, learning about it. It's a bit of a different way in therapy. And, that the relationship might be different. But yeah, it can be a sticking point sometimes if people want more than I'm able to give.
What's a belief that you once had about how you were working that you've let go of?
That I had to do it right, I would say. That was a long, long, long time. Like 5-10 years, I think, especially when I've just qualified, and maybe quite a long time after that, actually, of like just wanting to do it so well and wanting to get it right and wanting to be the best that I could be, and help everyone I came across, you know. And the more and more I let go of that, the more I kind of just relaxed and focused on being with them. I think the more helpful, however we describe that, it was. Yeah.
And what was it like for you when you just qualified, for example, and you felt like you weren't doing it well?
Yeah, disappointing. I think it was two way, in that leading up to sessions, I would just have a lot of tension because I would so want to get it right, and then afterwards, sometimes it would go well, sometimes it wouldn't, and I might, you know, I think I am generally quite reflective, so I would always be looking back on sessions anyway. Sometimes it'd be a bit disappointing, and sometimes I'd feel like I'd almost like lose my way a little bit. I remember reading a lot after I'd qualified and like almost embodying the person I was reading, you know, because I was just trying to find my way and my way of practicing. So I guess I was a bit lost as well in that, in terms of how it felt. It just took a long time to shake that. And so it was a hard lesson. It's like I didn't even realize it for years. It's only, I think we were talking about it before, it's like it's only when you let go of it, and when you were saying about when you say that thing you need to say, it's kind of similar in that once I'd let go of that, that I realized how much I was carrying before. And it was even represented, you know, the thing that makes me really notice it now is when I look back, I had like, I wore certain clothes for therapy. So I'd wear a shirt and I'd wear kind of smart trousers and smart shoes. And now I just like, it's just my clothes, you know. So for me, that like shows the difference in how I am and how I practice now. And that feels a lot more integrated, and it feels a lot more authentic, that I'm not going to work to do this role that is quite uptight in a way, but that I'm just going to be me with another person in the best way that I can, with a view to kind of be with them, you know.
What would you say have been the greatest benefits of doing the work that you've done?
Like the ripple effects, I think, is when I think about that sometimes, is unbelievable. Like, not only to see the kind of profundity and the beauty of someone like finding their authenticity, but then, and it often happens randomly, but then to also see and hear about the ripples that has, you know, of like the ripples it has on their relationships, what they have passed on to others as a result of it, how many lives it's impacted because of this one client's hard work, you know. So for me, that's just an amazing gift and such a like honor to be trusted and in that space with someone. But then to also see what happens as a result of that, and how far reaching that can be.
What's one thing that you think that people are really lacking or in need of in today's world?
I think the power of being able to be authentic, to be able to be authentic in relationship and have that connection, and the kind of depth of relating and being. I think there's so many things that are kind of drawing us out of ourselves, that are distracting us or that are isolating us or that are, I guess to go back when we were talking about that conditionality before, about that idea of conditionality when we're growing up, there's also so much conditionality as an adult, and I think we are at the mercy of a lot of that, especially, things like social media, that type of thing that, I think it can create this tension about who and how we should be.
We did a really interesting experiential exercise in the training, and we were given pieces of paper and asked to cut out eye holes in the paper so that we could wear it as a mask. And on the one side, we were asked to graphically represent our persona. And by that, it meant, who do you think you present to the world and who do you think the world sees when they look at you? So people did that. And then we went around the room meeting each other in role as our persona. And the really interesting thing about that part of the exercise was how unhappy everyone was embodying that person that they'd drawn or whatever they'd created. And then the second half was to reverse the paper, and on the reverse side, to graphically represent your true self. So who are you beneath the persona? Who's the real you that the world doesn't often get to see? And people represented that. And then to go around the room again and meet everyone again as the true self and the difference in the energy. But also then, as a training exercise, to have that stark, this is how I believe I act in the world, and this is who I believe I am, and what's the gap?
The interesting thing for me in what you're saying there is like the felt sense of that, like how that feels, not only what it represents in what is on the mask, but how we feel embodying those different parts, and just the freedom that can come from authenticity and the kind of lightness and the relief, but also the real beauty and authenticity, whatever that is so different in every client. But there's something of like, I can be myself here. I can tell you this part about myself and it feels good, and you're still here and you're still accepting.
What advice would you have for people who are training?
It's such a unique and precious moment to be able to have that space where all that learning is going on and all that opportunity in terms of process and self-awareness, that it might not feel like it at the moment, but I think once it's gone, it's very rare to get that space again, or you might just have it temporarily. So for me, there's something of like, this is the time to do the work. This is the time to really listen to what feedback you're getting, what is being said about you as a person. If you trust those people, or if you're hearing it repeatedly, it's almost like that is such good data to take in. And I think the training experience is a rare environment to be able to actually unpick that and process it with other people. So yeah, I'd just say, just like really lean into it as much as you're able. And the edges are where the work and the magic happens, I would say, to go to those uncomfortable spots, at least occasionally.
Who are some other person-centered writers that you really relate to, as well as Rogers?
I love Dave Mearn's writing. He's not working anymore as a therapist. He's started, I think, writing kind of novels and things now, but there's something that I really value about his kind of humanness. I've never met him, but just through his writing, there's something about his humanness, and reading some of his case studies with clients, you really get a sense of his work and that he kind of walks the walk that he's describing in his books as well. Barbara Teminer Broadley, I also love her writing, is amazing. Her book, it's actually an edited book of like selected writings from her. But another thing for students, that's a fantastic book because she just breaks down a lot of chapters into the questions that you're always asking, particularly around person-centered therapy anyway. And I really love the way she writes, and you get a real sense of her commitment to person-centered practice and sharing her knowledge, and it feels very human as well.
In the work that you've done with clients, without going into detail about what they said. How have you come away from a session feeling profoundly affected?
I think if I'm really in touch with the kind of either the tenderness or the fragility of another person that can happen in the session. And I think that can sometimes be linked to a kind of compassion in a way, for someone to kind of share their story and sometimes just think, gosh, almost like you poor thing that you've had to live that has been your life. And for them to be able to then take the risk to share that and let me into that, feels deeply, deeply moving. And then the other side of that, I think about in relation to your question is to see that kind of becoming, I think that I've talked about before, is to sometimes I have to kind of zoom out a bit because it's almost like when you see yourself every day, you might not notice change as much, and that can happen a bit in clients. And then if we're coming to the end of the work or we're reviewing or something like that, and I think, oh gosh, that's the person that came to me in that first session, and now you're here, and to think of wow, what a change. They might even look different, they might act different, they might have different relationships, they might have made changes in their lives, and to just see that play out. And to be able to think the courage that's taken, the risk that's taken, the strength that's taken from the client it's just like you can just marvel at it sometimes and just have so much respect for them. I remember reading something from Yolom who said, make sure you're open to be changed by your clients, because there's something about that openness that shows the attitude you're coming with, and if you kind of come as a kind of closed, rigid thing, it's going to affect the relationship. So if we allow ourselves to be changed by clients, impacted by clients, I think that can point to something about how we're bringing ourselves to that space.
How optimistic are you about the future?
I don't know if I'm that optimistic at the moment. I think what that is to do with is not about necessarily human nature, but more about the power structures. So what I think I'm seeing happens and what tends to happen is that there is a lot of power held by a few people or a few groups. And so then I think it changes the game a little bit in terms of saying what is human nature or what's the collective of a population to who are the people with the power and what do they do and decide. And the kind of trickle down effect of that, we're seeing it every day in all areas of life. The impacts of that can be so huge because of a few people and a few decisions. I guess it's almost this existential thing where you come to realize fairness maybe isn't a thing. We expect it in life that it's life should be fair, but that's what happens with trauma is it tells us life isn't fair, And so I think I see something similar is that it takes away something around kind of fairness and equality and equity. And I think we're seeing that play out. So I think my worry is I don't know how far that goes and how repairable that will be and how much we might be able to overturn that. And the data so far is not great in that. So, I'm kind of holding my breath for a little bit to see how that plays out.
One of the things that I see coming down the road is this crisis of meaning, particularly as people's jobs get replaced. If people go on to universal basic income, their sense of being able to find purpose and meaning in the world will be an increasing challenge. And I was just wondering to what extent you thought the ideas that underpin your work have a role to play in helping us move through that.
The other maybe week or month, I was asked about the impact of AI on therapy. And I guess in line with what you're asking there was something for me about actually it could have more importance, because if we're living in a world where we're not having that connection, like you're saying, we're not having that meaning, then maybe these spaces that are about that are about human connection, that are about meaning making and understanding of relationship, grow in importance. It's hard to know for sure, but I can see that if there's a kind of trend one way, then the opposite can become more important. And that might be the way we go. I think that's the good outcome of that could happen.